She said it like it meant nothing. Celeste stood in our kitchen on a Friday evening, arms crossed, voice flat, and told me that if I didn't sign over my share of our joint investment portfolio by the end of the month, she would freeze my access to every account we shared. I remember the exact way she tilted her head, like she was reading a grocery list. "You have until the 30th, she said. "And before you start talking about your contributions, let me save you the time. Everything we have today is because of my vision. Your years of grinding away at that job." Background noise, Aaron. Honestly. Then she laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short, quiet one that carried more weight than any argument could have. I stood at the kitchen counter and said nothing. No explosion, no slammed door. I just looked at her and tried to understand what I was actually seeing. The woman speaking to me had been my wife for 9 years. The investment portfolio she was demanding I surrender had been built from both our incomes and sacrifices over nearly a decade together. And she was calling hers alone. I didn't answer her that evening, but a decision was already forming somewhere very quiet inside me. The following weekend, Celeste hosted a small gathering for friends we had known for years. I helped set up, pour drinks, and listened. I had always been the quieter one in the room, the one people forgot was there until they needed something. Halfway through the evening, the conversation turned to finances. It always did with this group. They talked about investments, property, market trends. Celeste thrived in these conversations. She was sharp, confident, and commanded attention when she spoke. Then she looked across the room at me and said, casually and without any apparent concern for my presence, "Aaron could never really handle money responsibly. Good thing one of us has an eye for it." The table laughed politely. Her friend Diane nodded in quiet agreement. Her cousin Marcus, who had never warmed to me much, smiled into his glass. I smiled too, a small, steady smile, because no one at that table knew what I had done 3 days after Celeste's ultimatum. No one knew the calls I had already made, the files I had begun quietly building, the moves I had started to set in motion. They saw a man being gently dismissed. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually looking at. Let me tell you who Aaron Whitfield was before any of this happened. I grew up in a modest house with parents who counted every dollar carefully and taught me to do the same. My father worked in logistics. My mother taught school. Neither of them had much, but neither of them wasted what they had. I learned early that money was not something you displayed. It was something you protected. I studied finance at university, not because it was glamorous, but because numbers made sense to me in a way that felt completely natural. After graduating, I spent 11 years at a mid-sized investment management firm, working from junior analyst to portfolio manager. I reviewed risk assessments daily. I understood how money moved, how it could be structured, and how it could be defended. When Celeste and I married, I handled the bulk of our actual financial planning. The portfolio she now claimed as her vision had been structured largely by me. She had a genuine eye for opportunity. I turned those opportunities into properly managed plans. I had never needed recognition for that. I had never asked for credit, but I'd always kept records. Careful, organized, thoroughly dated records. I had never imagined I would need them the way I was about to. I didn't get blindsided entirely. Looking back, the warning signs had been there. I had simply chosen not to add them up. There was a night, about 14 months before the ultimatum, when I found Celeste in the garage on her phone, speaking quietly with her back fully turned. She ended the call the moment she heard me and said it was a work contact. I didn't push. There was an investment account under a holding name I didn't recognize, something I noticed while reviewing a quarterly tax document. She explained it as a new structure her financial contact had recommended. I accepted that. There were casual questions she had started asking about our portfolio's ownership split. How would things work if accounts were restructured? What did joint versus sole ownership mean in practice? I answered honestly. I trusted her. Then there were the late evenings when she came home quieter than usual, made calls behind closed doors, and deflected schedule questions with smooth, practiced answers. I remember sitting alone one evening with all of these pieces in front of me and thinking, I already know what this is. I had known for months. I had been hoping I was wrong. Standing in that kitchen on a Friday evening, I finally understood I hadn't been wrong at all. I started the morning after the ultimatum. Celeste left early for a meeting, and I sat at my desk for 2 hours before work, moving carefully through the financial structure we had built together. I knew it better than she had ever realized. Every account, every fund, every asset trail. I had reviewed it, organized it, and in many cases built it from nothing. I began with the simplest step, transferring 3 investment holdings listed under joint ownership, but funded entirely from my income. My firm's legal team had confirmed years earlier, for unrelated reasons, that sole-funded joint assets had a specific reclassification path available under the right conditions. I had kept that information filed carefully. I didn't move anything recklessly or quickly. I moved only what was legally mine to move, methodically, with supporting documentation attached to each action. I also started a private folder on a personal drive, not a shared cloud, a physical drive in my desk drawer. Every transaction record, every historical contribution log, every relevant email and document from our entire financial history together. Celeste came home that evening and made dinner and talked about a commercial property she had seen. She was entirely calm. She had no idea the ground had already begun to shift beneath her plan. 2 weeks after the ultimatum, I was in the living room with a book I wasn't really reading when Celeste's phone buzzed beside her. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, and laughed, the same short, quiet laugh in the kitchen that Friday. She didn't turn the phone face down quickly enough. I didn't try to read the message. I didn't need to. The name at the top was her friend Diane, and the preview text was visible for 2 full seconds before the screen dimmed. It read, "He still has no idea how completely you've set this up." Celeste glanced over at me. I had my eyes on my book. I turned a page. She relaxed and set the phone face down this time. I kept reading, or appearing to. Inside, I was cataloging everything carefully. The timeline the message implied. What set this up meant in context of the moves I'd already found in our financial records. The confidence those 7 words revealed. She believed the outcome was already decided. The box sealed, result guaranteed. That was the moment I understood something important. The most powerful advantage I had was the one she didn't know she had given me. Her certainty, her comfort, her complete belief that I would never see it coming. I want to be honest about something. Not every moment of this period was strategy. Some of it was just trying to function. I want to work every day. I reviewed portfolio reports, sat in client meetings, gave advice to people who trusted me to protect what they had built. I was good at my job, even on days when everything inside me felt like static. I had been trained to separate professional focus from personal noise, and I leaned on that training hard. At lunch, I sometimes sat alone near the window in our building's cafe. Not out of sadness, more out of needing somewhere quiet to think without performing calm for anyone. A junior analyst on my team, a young man named Patrick, stopped by once and asked if I was all right. I told him I was working through something. He nodded and didn't press further. I appreciated that more than he knew. I thought about my father during those lunches. He had told me once, after I made a bad early investment in my 20s, the loss isn't the problem. The problem is if you don't learn patience after it. I was practicing patience. I was building something. And the most important part of building carefully is knowing when not to move yet. About 3 weeks into my preparations, Celeste made her first formal move. She sent me an email, not a conversation, an email outlining a proposed restructuring of our joint finances. The language was careful and legal sounding, which told me she had been working with someone professional on the wording. The proposal would have effectively transferred majority control of the investment portfolio into a holding account in her name alone. She framed it as simplifying our financial picture. I read it twice. Then I forwarded a copy to my personal drive. I replied calmly that I would review it and respond within a few days. She replied almost immediately, "Take your time." But the 30th is still the date. What she didn't know was that 3 of the investments she was planning to fold into her restructuring had already been individually reclassified. The documentation was filed. The transactions were clean, legal, and complete. The accounts she believed she was preparing to take over were no longer structured the way she thought. She had built an entire plan around a map that was no longer accurate. I watched her move confidently along that map and said nothing. I cooked dinner that night and asked how her day had gone. I found the hidden account by accident. I had been reviewing a recurring quarterly transfer in our household records, a modest amount, automatically processed. When I traced the destination account number, it led somewhere unexpected. The account was in Celeste's name only. It had been opened 18 months earlier. Contributions had been flowing into it steadily from a source I recognized immediately. A small percentage redirected from one of our joint funds, routed through a reclassification I had never authorized. Each individual transfer was small enough not to stand out. Accumulated over 18 months, the total was significant. I sat with the documentation for a long time. I wasn't angry in the sharp, explosive way anger usually arrives. It was colder than that, a clarifying feeling. The kind that comes when a suspicion you've been reluctant to confirm gets confirmed beyond any reasonable question. I printed the records and added them to my folder. I did not confront Celeste. I did not change my behavior. I continued cooking dinner, watching television, responding to her messages in the same normal, measured tone I had maintained throughout everything. The folder was now thick. I had enough, but I still wasn't ready to use it. Celeste had lunch with Diane the following Thursday. I knew because she mentioned it before leaving that morning. What I didn't anticipate was what happened on the drive home. She had a habit of calling friends from the car immediately after seeing them, processing the conversation in real time. She meant to call Diane back. She called my number instead. It went to voicemail. She didn't realize until the message was already 3 minutes long. I listened to it once, saved it, and transferred the file to my drive. The relevant section was very clear. She talked about how the restructuring plan was already essentially done. She said I was too passive to push back seriously. She said that by the time I understood what had happened, it would be legally complete, and she would have the leverage to negotiate anything remaining entirely on her terms. She laughed as she said it. I thought about the hidden account, the redirected transfers, the formal email framed as simplification, the years of contributions she had called background noise. Every word of that voicemail was evidence. Every confident, dismissive sentence had been recorded. I had been staying quiet because patience was the plan. But now I also had her own voice telling me exactly what I needed to defeat it. I made an appointment with an attorney the following Monday. Her name was Attorney Pierce. She specialized in financial and matrimonial law and had been recommended by a colleague who had used her 2 years earlier during a business dispute. Her office was across the city, far enough from our neighborhood that I wouldn't encounter anyone we knew. I brought the folder. She spent 40 minutes reviewing the documents while I sat quietly across from her. Contribution records, transaction histories, the hidden account trail, the voicemail, the restructuring proposal, the 3 reclassified investment holdings. When she looked up, her expression was composed and direct. "Your position is stronger than you may realize," she said. She walked me through my legal standing on each point. The sole-funded reclassified holdings were solid. The unauthorized redirections from a joint fund were legally significant. The voicemail was potentially admissible. Most critically, if Celeste pushed her restructuring proposal forward, it would trigger a legal review, and that review would surface every document I had collected. "She's about to walk into something she hasn't prepared for," Attorney Pierce said. I nodded slowly. I had needed that confirmation. Now I was ready to let the next stage begin. The 30th arrived. Celeste came to the home office where I was working and asked if I had reviewed the restructuring proposal. Her tone was even, the careful, controlled voice she used when wanting to appear unbothered but paying very close attention. I told her I hadn't signed anything and didn't plan to. The shift in her expression was subtle but immediate. She said she would proceed without my agreement if she had to. I told her calmly that she was welcome to try. She went to her office, and I heard her on the phone within minutes. A short call, clipped sentences, then silence. The following morning, she attempted to access the joint investment accounts to initiate the transfer herself. The accounts were flagged. Not frozen, flagged. A legal hold placed by Attorney Pierce's office, triggered by documented evidence of unauthorized redirections constituting a potential breach of fiduciary duty between joint account holders. Her access wasn't blocked entirely, but every action she attempted would now be reviewed before execution. I heard her phone calls from across the house. 2 calls to Diane. A longer call to her own attorney. Her voice no longer even and controlled. For the first time since that Friday in the kitchen, I felt the balance shift. She came to me that evening with a different approach. Gone was the cold, executive manner. She sat at the dining table with a softer expression, hands folded, and began talking about her history. 9 years. The early apartment where we had argued about furniture and laughed at the leaking radiator. The first investment we had made together, modest, more symbolic than strategic, but ours. She said she hadn't meant for it to go this far. She said ambition had pushed her somewhere she hadn't intended. She said she missed the real partnership we once had. Her voice broke slightly at the end. I looked at her carefully. I had loved this woman for a long time. Part of me still did, in the way you can't entirely stop caring about someone woven into your life for nearly a decade. That part was real, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But I also had a 3-minute voicemail in which she had called me too passive to push back and laughed about taking everything we had built. Emotion and evidence don't cancel each other. They exist at the same time. You simply have to decide which one makes your decisions. I told her I appreciated her honesty. Then I said goodnight and went upstairs. Attorney Pierce gave me specific guidance on what I could and couldn't do during the legal hold period. I stayed carefully within those limits. But there were things entirely outside the legal process that required no engineering from me. Things that arranged themselves simply because Celeste had constructed a version of reality that couldn't hold up under scrutiny. Her cousin Marcus called me unexpectedly one afternoon. He had heard through the family that things between Celeste and me were strained. He asked directly what had happened. I gave him a measured, factual summary. No embellishment, no emotional appeals, no attempts to influence his position. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she told me you'd handled the finances badly, and she was trying to fix it. I told him I had the contribution records, if he wanted to review them. He said he'd be in touch. 2 days later, he called Celeste. I didn't hear that conversation, but she was noticeably quiet for the rest of that evening and spent a long time alone before dinner. I didn't celebrate it. I simply noted that when the accurate version of events becomes visible to people who matter, it tends to produce its own consequences without any assistance. That was always the point of having clean documentation. The weeks that followed were difficult for Celeste in ways that had nothing to do with anything I had done. Her restructuring plan, now legally flagged, had created a paper trail that her financial contact was not comfortable being associated with. He quietly withdrew without warning, leaving several of her planned moves mid-process and exposed. The private account, built from redirected joint funds, was now part of an active legal review. She couldn't access it without the review completing, and the review would take time. Her social circle was shifting. Marcus had apparently spoken to at least one other family member, because the warmth at family gatherings had become quieter around her in a way it hadn't been before. Nobody confronted her openly, but the easy, reflexive support she had always counted on was no longer automatic. At her workplace, she ran business development for a regional property firm. Word had circulated about the financial review attached to her personal accounts. I had not placed that information anywhere. The legal process had its own visibility in professional networks. None of this was something I had engineered in detail. I had placed accurate documentation in the right hands at the right time. The rest followed the logic of truth, finding its own level. A shift happened at work that I hadn't anticipated. 2 senior partners at my firm had known Celeste and me for years. They had been to our home for dinner. When news filtered through that our finances were in a legal dispute, one of them, a man named Victor who had mentored me early in my career, called me into his office. I expected an awkward conversation about keeping personal matters separate from professional conduct. Instead, Victor placed a client file on the desk in front of me. A high-net-worth client came in last week, he said. She's navigating a complex financial separation from a business partner. She needs someone who understands both the investment structure side and the legal documentation process. He paused. I thought of you immediately. I took the file. He added, I've watched how you've handled the past 2 months. Steady, documented, no unnecessary drama. That's exactly the kind of judgment this client needs. I thanked him and walked back to my office. On the way down the corridor, I thought about Celeste's voice on that voicemail. Too passive to push back seriously. Passivity and patience were not the same thing. And patience, properly applied, had a way of being recognized by the people who were actually paying attention. Celeste made one more significant move. With her restructuring plan stalled and the legal hold in place, she tried a different approach. She redirected a portion of a separate asset, a commercial property investment she managed independently, outside our joint portfolio, into a high-risk development fund that her former financial contact had recommended before walking away. I learned about it through the legal review process, which now had visibility into her connected financial activity as part of the fiduciary dispute assessment. Attorney Pierce called me the morning the filing came through. She's taken a leveraged position in a development fund that's currently under separate regulatory review, she said. It's not directly part of our dispute, but it's now adjacent to it. 2 weeks later, the fund was publicly suspended pending investigation. Celeste's redirected funds were frozen inside it. She had made the move out of desperation, trying to build a separate financial position strong enough to negotiate from. Instead, she had walked into an investigation with no connection to our dispute and become collateral to it. The suspension was reported in a trade publication covering regional property finance. Several people who knew us both reached out asking if I was all right. I hadn't touched that investment and had no connection to it whatsoever. Things accelerated after the development fund suspension. Celeste's private account remained frozen pending the legal review. The redirected joint fund contributions were fully documented and would be addressed in the formal dispute resolution. Her former financial contact, who had quietly exited weeks earlier, was now being questioned as part of the regulatory review. His name appeared in 2 trade articles within the same week. Diane had stopped calling as regularly. I noticed because Celeste mentioned it once, almost to herself, over breakfast. She didn't say it as a complaint. She said it the way people say things when they're beginning to understand the weight of what they've done. Marcus came by the house unexpectedly one Saturday morning. He asked to speak with me alone. We stood in the front garden, and he told me he had reviewed the financial records I shared and confirmed the same figures with an independent accountant. He apologized for his behavior at that dinner months earlier. I told him I understood and didn't hold it against him. When he left, I went inside and made coffee and sat at my desk for a while. I thought, this is what the other side of patience looks like once you've waited long enough to get there. A turning point came through someone I hadn't expected. Celeste had a close friend from university, a woman named Priya, who had always been polite but slightly reserved around me. She had been a consistent presence at gatherings for years and had always been firmly in Celeste's corner. I had accepted that as completely natural. About 7 weeks after the legal hold was placed, Priya reached out to me directly. Her message was careful and deliberate. She said she had been watching the situation unfold and had heard different versions of events from different people. She told me she had asked Celeste directly about the joint fund redirections and hadn't received a satisfying answer. Then she had spoken with Marcus. She said she didn't know what to say to Celeste right now, but she wanted me to know that she understood what had actually happened. You handled this with more grace than most people would have managed, she wrote. I replied simply that I had tried to do what was right throughout. She responded, that's exactly what I mean. Priya's shift was significant. Not because it changed anything legally or financially, but because Celeste valued her opinion above almost everyone else's. The silence from that direction hit harder than any public embarrassment could have. The professional consequences reached Celeste in early spring. Her firm had been aware of the legal review attached to her personal accounts since early in the process. These things travel in professional networks when they involve recognizable names. She had managed to contain the impact for a while, but the development fund suspension changed everything. The fund had been publicly named in a regulatory filing. Celeste's name appeared in connected documentation as an investor who had entered during the active review window, a detail that, regardless of intent, raised serious questions about her professional judgment. Her firm placed her on administrative review. She was removed from 2 major client accounts pending the outcome. She called me the evening the decision was made. Her voice was very quiet. No requests for help, no attempts to negotiate. She simply said, I didn't think it would go this far. I listened. Then I said, I know. A long pause followed. She asked if we could talk properly soon. I told her we could speak through our attorneys for now. I didn't say it to hurt her. I said it because it was the right boundary. When I ended the call, I sat quietly and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but a deep, settled relief. Attorney peers called with a formal outcome 6 weeks later. The legal review of the joint fund redirections had concluded. The documentation I had provided, contribution histories, transfer trails, the hidden account records, the voicemail, the full timeline, had been assessed in full. The unauthorized redirections constituted a clear breach of joint account fiduciary obligations. The funds were to be restored and the private account dissolved. Additionally, the 3 investment holdings I had reclassified at the outset, the sole funded assets, were formally confirmed in my name. The restructuring proposal Celeste had attempted was invalid on those assets and could not proceed. My legal standing was complete. Every position I had taken was fully validated. Celeste's attorney had filed counter-objections on 2 points. Both were dismissed based on the documentation record. The portfolio was mine to manage. Attorney peers sounded satisfied on the call. The measured, professional satisfaction of someone whose careful preparation had held up completely under scrutiny. I thanked her and set the phone down. Then I opened the physical folder on my desk, the one I had started the morning after the ultimatum, and looked at it quietly for a moment. 9 months of patient, documented, careful work. I closed the folder and filed it away. That part was done. I gave myself 1 week of quiet after the resolution. No major decisions, no planning sessions, no calls to attorneys or financial contacts. I walked in the mornings, cooked meals I had been putting off learning, and read in the evenings without an agenda. Then I went back to work, the kind of work that had always made sense to me. With the portfolio confirmed in my name and the legal process finalized, I restructured and reinvested methodically. Clear short-term objectives, longer-term positioning, risk assessed at every stage. I approached it exactly as I would any client account. Victor gave me the high net worth client he had mentioned months earlier. It was complex and time-intensive. I found that I was good at it in a way that felt renewed, sharper than before, honed by months of having to be precise when everything was on the line. Within 4 months, 2 additional significant client accounts came my way through referrals. A colleague told me the word circulating in certain professional circles was reliable. I thought about that table at the dinner gathering. The polite laughter. Marcus's smile. Could never handle money responsibly. I didn't need to send anyone updated figures. The results were visible to anyone paying attention. That was more than enough. I heard about Celeste in the months that followed. Not from anyone reporting to me, but through the natural way information moves in connected networks. The administrative review at her firm concluded without dismissal. I was genuinely glad to hear it. She had been reassigned rather than let go. A professional step back, but not a permanent collapse. The development fund remained suspended. Her funds inside were tied up indefinitely, a situation that could take years to resolve fully. Her social circle had contracted. Priya had remained distant, but not hostile, simply no longer the constant presence she had always been. Marcus had moved firmly to my side of things. I didn't follow these updates closely. I noted them the way you note the weather, aware, but not building plans around it. What I want to say about this period is simply that I felt no pleasure in her difficulties. There's a version of this kind of story where the protagonist quietly savors every piece of news about the other person's decline. I understand the appeal of that version, but I was genuinely tired of the drama and glad to be past it. I was building something now. That was the only direction worth facing. About a year after Celeste had stood in our kitchen and told me my years of hard work were background noise, I attended a professional recognition dinner held by my firm. Victor introduced me briefly to the room as one of the firm's standout portfolio managers of the year. 1 paragraph, measured and genuine. In a room full of people whose professional judgment I respected, it landed cleanly. I shook hands, accepted congratulations, and spent most of the evening in genuine conversation with 2 potential new clients who had been directed my way by existing ones. On the drive home, I thought about the kitchen, the flat voice, the short, quiet laugh. Your years of grinding away at that job. Background noise, Aaron. Honestly, I didn't feel anger when I replayed it now. What I felt was something closer to gratitude. Not for what she had done, but for what it had forced me to become. The months of precise documentation, careful legal preparation, and professional sharpening that had come from the sheer necessity of having to be exact when everything mattered, all of it had made me genuinely better. She had called it background noise. It had become the loudest outcome in the room. Looking back from the other side of everything, I want to say something honest. This story isn't really about revenge. I know it reads that way sometimes, but that's not where you end up when you're actually living it. What I learned in the year between that Friday in the kitchen and the recognition dinner was this: preparation beats emotion every time. When Celeste issued that ultimatum, reacting immediately, from anger or hurt, would have cost me everything I was trying to protect. Instead, I documented. I verified. I took legal counsel. I moved carefully within what was right and provable. I protected what was mine not by matching aggression, but by being more thorough than she expected. The second lesson was equally important. Respect yourself first. Not loudly. Not as a performance. In the decisions you make when no one is watching and the outcome isn't guaranteed. And the third, the one I return to most, is this: success built to prove something to a doubter is fragile. But success that comes from who you genuinely are, that stands on its own. Celeste called my work background noise. I had simply kept working. The only sound that mattered was something real I had built myself. That was enough. It always had been.